All right, family, welcome back to the Revolution podcast. I'm excited to talk philosophy, NFTs, economics, why they matter, what the hell are they? And I'm joined here today by Daniel Garner, also known as OG Rose. It doesn't stand for Original Gangster, it stands for Opperman Garner Rose.
Yes.
Daniel and his wife, Michelle,
Yes.
run a YouTube channel and they write poetry. They're authors, philosophers. Daniel's been published on Amazon and has a number of different collaborations, including with my co-author, Cattle Last, which you may have seen from Sexuality, Masculinity, and God. And I'm excited to continue our conversation where we left it off on Daniel's YouTube channel, which was a lot of different angles. And I'm excited to continue it again with you, brother.
Excellent. I'm thrilled to be here, Kevin. Thank you for having me. This is really a delight. I love the work that you do. I love the topic of the NFTs, the different approaches to it, on the coaching you do. So thank you so much, Kevin.
Yeah. So for the folks that may not know about you and your story, your work, I wonder if you could give us a little of the abridged version of how did you end up being interested in things like Hegel and philosophy and economics and NFTs?
That's a great question, Kevin. Well, I suppose starting when I was about 10 years old, I spent all my time walking in the woods, getting lost in the mountains, and coming up with like a science fiction series called The Sword of Tribulation that I spent my childhood, ripping off characters out of Final Fantasy and Chrono Cross and putting them together in these epic stories. So taking these walks, thinking, then started stories and then I always liked stories that explored big ideas. So would get into the philosophical concepts and like that. I actually think story is a wonderful way to show on an emotional level and in a very intricate way some of the big philosophical quandaries or ideas. So it kind of started in story. And then from there, you mentioned Michelle. I had the great fortune of meeting my wife, Michelle, in a library, the place of all great romance, and 2009 or so. And like you said, Opperman Garner Rose, Opperman Garner Rise together. We work together in different things, short stories and fiction and so on and so forth. I've always, I got into a habit of, and I learned this from Benjamin Franklin in his autobiography, where he talked about if you want to learn to write, he would take the newspapers in the morning and verbatim copy them out, and that was the way that he taught to read. So, for example, I gave The Sword of Tribulation to a writing teacher at UVA, and they kind of laughed because I went to college. Like they laughed at UVA. They're like, "This is not real literature," and it kind of pissed me off. Honestly, I was like, "Well, I can do fiction, frick." So then I started going in more of the literary fiction direction out of, I don't want to say spite, but maybe that would be honest. And so then what I did was like reading, I was like, oh, well, I want to do something on like a Southern character. So I would read Faulkner and I would copy out sections out of Faulkner to teach the style, and then Hemingway and Flannery O'Connor and things, and so on and so forth, all these different documents. Well, then that turned into, I was like, well, I need kind of ideas for these stories. So then you read philosophers and you start doing the same thing, like Hume. I did a lot, and I do a lot. Scottish Enlightenment, people like Foucault and different things. So you copy that. But then I started going, as you copied it out, you would start having ideas. And then you started doing papers. And then you as like philosophical papers. And so it transcended into these essays, because I actually find that I don't tend to remember ideas that I don't write out or I don't write a paper on. And I certainly am not any good at recalling ideas I read until I put them into a written process. And as I went in, then, you do that for years, and suddenly you eventually have a book and you're like, oh, look, a book, The Conflict of Mind. And you're like, oh, Reconstructing ASA. Oh, The Fate is Beauty. So I would say that is the improving, the stumbling around to end up with where we are now. And along the way, 3 children showed up in a farm, and Michelle and I, we helped run an art gallery venue performance place called Eunoia, which is Greek for beautiful thinking. And the word Eunoia I always like, because it also means like beautiful, good. It has like beauty, good, and true all in that one word, kind of is all brought together. So those are all part of the adventure, my good man.
I love it. I mean, this is something that's interesting. When writing was invented, or this is, I don't know if this is a true story, people were concerned that the oral tradition would be lost, right? Memorization would be lost, because they started scribing things onto, I guess, first stone tablets and cave walls, and then onto papyrus and things. And there is something interesting about the interplay between memory, our voice and language, and then writing, and how they each kind of play out. I find I'm very visual. So if I see something deeply, I can remember it forever if I really put energy onto it. But I also know that writing is one of the deepest ways to remember. And a lot of people are like, oh, if I don't write it down, I won't remember it. And so this method you're talking about from old Ben Frank sounds like it's quite powerful. Just copying something down, transcribing, and then working with that information.
Oh yeah, and like for example, so if you go, oh, I want to do a short story that has that takes place in Bedford, Virginia, with twin brothers, and it has a kind of Southern style. Well, then getting all the books together that are in that realm, like grouping your books on your project, and then writing the style out. That's how that can give you sort of the style and the atmosphere that you're trying to create. Plato has that old story where you forget writing. Neil Postman, William Ong. What's interesting, Mr. Ong talks about how the existence of the scientific treatise, for example, was not even possible until writing came into existence. But it came at the cost of not having as good of memory. But in some respects, that opened the doors to creativity, because if you're not using your brain so much because you have to remember every little detail. I mean, like you go into parts of the Second Testament, the New Testament, and the Pharisees and Sadducees are talking about Jesus. It's kind of hard to understand what they're doing, but you have to realize that everyone sitting in that circle listening to Jesus, like, basically have the Torah memorized. Like everyone knows the lines. It's pretty crazy. And so when Jesus changes something, they're like, hey man, that's not how it goes in Kings. You're changing it. Like that whole culture of like everyone preserving to the T, every detail is kind of lost, but you trade that. It's always trade-offs, right? And trade-offs are pluses and minuses. Postman talks about technology is always a kind of Faustian bargain. You gain things, but you could lose things. It depends on how you use it. So likewise, it unlocked writing unlocked creative potential. It unlocked the ability to have these very complicated scientific treatises and different things like that. But on the flip side, it's hard to be creative if you don't recall the things and you don't have them lodged into your associational brain to bring them together. And that's where the writing or the writing it down, and also speaking, I think you can have a dialectic between speaking and writing. That's how you can actually generate the creativity, the new ideas, and to really absorb it. So, I think doing both, I think, is important.
100%. I mean, obviously writing, and then the invention of the printing press and the promulgation of actual texts, not just by religions or bureaucrats, became a huge, up level of a lot of the diversity of ideas. Because, if everyone just memorizes the Torah, and that's kind of the word is law, something interesting to bring in technology into the conversation is, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, for those that don't know, and the entire Bible, which is actually a library, it's a collection of texts, can be thought of as code. And that book or that collection, that anthology, was like the mainframe or the server of the culture.
Oh yeah.
And so the priests are like technicians memorizing the code. And if everyone knows the lines of code, and then Jesus, Neo, comes in, starts hacking the code, changing lines of code, then you're going to output a different program, aka culture. And so this is an interesting idea, because now we're kind of on the flip side. We're not memorizing ancient texts. We're bombarded by literal code from our devices and our screens all day long. And so I'm curious, where does that inversion affect culture? And I certainly think technology is a Faustian bargain, and hopefully we're bargaining well.
Excellent. No, this is magnificent. Derrida's On Grammatology makes the argument that the type of philosophy that people come up with is tied to their information medium. So like the history of writing, transition into speaking, how metaphysics generates as a result of that. Like before you have the word, on paper, there's this gap that opens between the signifier and the signified. So there's this metaphysical gap that opens up. And he says, the kind of metaphysics that people did transformed once they started dealing with writing, as opposed to when I speak, it feels as if it's not the case, but it kind of feels as if the gap between the signifier and the signified is not there. Even though it is, because the definition of the word doesn't equal the word, it's more hidden. But as writing was developed, it became more obvious that that gap was there. And then metaphysics kind of came in to explain that gap, or was erected around that gap. And so Derrida's deconstructive act is to sort of say, well, that gap, you can't actually create a metaphysics there because you can never close the gap. But similarly, and this is where Mr. Bard, argues, and people like Postman or McLuhan or so on, is that society is radically organized by its information technology, rather it be the oral, the voice, rather it be written, rather it be the printing press, and so on and so forth. The nature of the society is going to absolutely reflect the way that it gets information. It's easy to forget this, but arguably information is I don't want to say it is the culture, but kind of is the culture in some respects. It is what makes the culture possible. And if information, so you mentioned how in the past, if everyone's memorizing this one book, you know, the Torah, Upanishads, but these different traditions or so on, then there's a kind of unity that people have, and it kind of brings people together. But here's the risk. There's also a potential loss of creativity and oppression that can happen because everyone has to conform to that text. Well, as you move beyond that into our world today, and you get more creative and more creative possibility, what is everyone talking about now? The meaning crisis. It's hard to know what to do. People don't have direction. It's not by chance that the movement from the book, the written word, pure memorization to pure creativity also leads to a loss of knowing what to do. Because another way, you know, with Vervaeke's meaning crisis, meaning is also direction. It's kind of a direction crisis. And the funny thing is, it's an overload of directions. It's not that it's like literally you're closed in a room called the Torah and you're forced to stay in there. It's like there's so many things you could do that you don't know what to do. It's the problem of noise without a signal. And so, you know, this I think gets into NFTs because what you have is the internet is this overload of quote unquote information and noise. You're utterly free, but you're so free that you don't know the direction to put that freedom in. And you're looking for a signal. You're looking for a signal in the noise. And how exactly do you get a signal in the noise? Where you're not forced to go a certain direction. There's a lot of creative possibility. But freedom is existentially difficult. It's hard to figure out what to do. Like Erich Fromm, Philip Ree, Freud, all these people talked about that. But do you really want to live in a world where you're forced to stay in the room called the Torah or something, or you're forced to stay in a certain set of givens? There's a ditch on either side of the road. You can have givens you can never leave, so that's oppressive. Or you can have so much freedom that it all feels arbitrary. And as Philip Reeve talks about, in that situation of extreme freedom, there can be an existential anxiety that makes totalitarianism appealing because you want that direction. Right. And now we can see all the political movements.
Well, this is where Orwell and Huxley painted those two ditches for us, right?
Oh, yeah.
Orwell painted, you know, the loss of freedom and the fear-based control, which I think we're seeing a lot of Orwellian action right now in the world. But also the tech companies, Facebook, aka Meta, Google, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, have perfected the Huxley version.
Oh, sure.
Which is a panoplia of pleasure and I call it the dopamine casino. It's just constant stimulation and so much freedom that it appears that meaning, directionality, especially for young men, young women who are growing up inside of this. It's extremely challenging. And, you know, this is where we will invoke the metaverse, right? So all these people are worried about the metaverse, right? Facebook, old Mark Zuckerberg, as I like to call him, he rebranded ahead of the curve a little bit. I mean, he was a little late to the party, but they're like, hey, our company's Meta now, and we're going to do this big announcement. And what's funny is people are like, I don't want to live in the metaverse. This is terrible. They're imagining the Matrix and people in goo pods being harvested. And certainly that is a potential. But we're already in the metaverse. Right now, Daniel, you and I are on the screen, high definition streaming. We're in the metaverse and people are watching this live. We're already in the metaverse. Most people, especially folks like me, digital nomads, even increasingly since coronavirus, anyone in corporate or academia, what's happening? You're on Zoom calls all day. You're doing meetings, you're in the metaverse. We already inhabit it. So now, and I'll kick to you this idea, as a technologist and as a mystic and an earth lover. I'm very also pagan. Me and Bard may share a little bit of that. We got to get me, you, Bard, and last on a duel. That would be fun. For those don't know, shout out to Alexander Bard, Cattle last. But
absolutely.
I want to invoke more of nature, more of the good, the true, the beautiful, more philosophy, which is the love of wisdom, into the technology. So let's actually seize the reins and create the metaverse we want to be in, not the dystopian one.
Oh no, so a few things. One, I just had a delightful conversation with Pei over at Attention on Franz Kafka. And in Kafka, there's the idea that individuals, by their own standards of value, rationality, and what they should do, act in such a way in society that contributes to their own enslavement, where there's no one forcing you to say, Joseph K., ring the bell at the beginning. There's no one forcing him to say, go visit the lawyer and different things. But he, because he feels like he's a victim of an injustice or that there's something wrong, then rationally organizes himself in a manner where his own oppression is emergent. It's something that comes unto him. And this is that's an elaborate discussion. I think Franz Kafka, as you mentioned, Orwell and Huxley, I think Kafka is actually an extremely important individual in that discussion. Neil Postman opens Amusing Ourselves to Death saying that, Huxley's more right than Orwell. Absolutely. I think Kafka, though, also gives you a description of the way that people and the government itself are all trapped in this self-feeding emergent system that leads to everyone ending up in a result they don't want to end up in. And then when the government screws up, for example, they don't want to admit they screwed up because they're people just like you and me. And then they try to make up for it by taking a strong hand. Then the people, when they actually do something dumb and contribute to their enslavement, they then act like they knew what they were doing the whole time. And it becomes this kind of black comedy joke. And it's this complicated emergent result that I think is really key, because I think that also happens today as people are looking for a signal in all the noise of all the information. There's all the talk of fake news and so on and so forth. People are also simultaneously trying to conceal the fact that they're confused by the lack of information, that there's not a good signal. And in that, we contribute to making our situation worse and worse. And then to run from that confusion, we just jump online and look for the dopamine, as you talked about, because all of that is too difficult. Let's just go to the dopamine. So then we flee to Huxley. So we run from Kafka to Huxley. It's not a good mix-up. On what you said about nature, I live on a farm. I definitely think that nature is very important. I mentioned taking all the walks in the woods and different things like that. It's always there's basically always a problem when you get a pure anything. Like if you're pure urban, there's a problem. If you're pure internet, there's a problem. But if you're pure anti-internet, there's a problem. And if you're pure country, obviously, because I love Cadell so much and we talk so much, the dialectic is very important. Like I can tell you, like talking about nature. So for example, you spend a lot of time planting a garden. You go out and weed it, you get your tomatoes and you're so thrilled. And then you come out and see the deer ate it all. Nature doesn't really care much about you. Nature is beautiful and wonderful and you love you, and then it eats your friggin' tomatoes. Or, I have to keep in the well house a light on over the pipes because they'll freeze, because nature will freeze my pipes, and then I won't have water, and that would be quite terrible. So nature, and we're always, nature is this wonderful thing that I do think is absolutely the case that human beings thrive if they're connected with. But then at the same time, there is a reason that civilization formed. There is a reason that people invented certain technologies, heaters and things like that, because nature is this thing we need to be connected with, but it is also something that will simultaneously freeze us to death in the winter. We're cutting down the trees of the forest precisely, which is terrible. You're mistreating nature, but you're doing it precisely so that you can survive the winter of which nature brings onto you. So now, in response to that, that's what you could be tempted to say, nature's dumb. I'm just going to go to the freaking food line or whatever and get my groceries. Well, let me tell you that I can, if you eat a lot of vegetables that you grow from your own garden, and then you eat the ones that come from the store, you can tell a difference. You can really tell a difference. And then you start seeing, I'm not an expert in the field, but you do see all the different health problems and different things that people have. Could be something going on. Not sure. So there is a great loss that occurs if you say don't grow your own food. But it is also understandable while people would want to go to the city, because existing out in a farm in the middle of nowhere where you never see anyone, or a trip to town takes, isn't a month event, that's all very inconvenient. And then the wolves come and they're a threat. It's understandable. But just as technology is a kind of game of figuring out how to balance it, not to idolize a world of pure memory, where the internet is all evil. We simultaneously have to see the good and the bad of nature and the good and the bad of the city, and become more, more dialectical in our thinking, really. And it's not the other thing too, there's a big talk on, there's a lot of talk on the game B, the Dark Renaissance. That's all a big discussion that is going on. It absolutely seems to be the case that certain tribes of a certain scale, involving a certain size of people, can do very, very well on a very unurbanized, untechnological way of life. It would seem like in Amish communities, they seem to do just fine. The problem always becomes the problem of scale. Once you're inviting lots of people who have different ideologies, different personalities, who that's when it becomes tricky. And then that's when you start creating the pricing mechanism, or your hike, and you're the knowledge problem, or von Mises on the coordination problem, because you're having to figure out how to get bottles of water to Florida, not just how to get water for your tribe. And once you do that, it seems like you have to convince people to go run conveyor belts who don't want to run conveyor belts so they can produce the bottles. And that means how do you convince them to do something? You say, well, money. Oh, well, now we've introduced money, and now you get all the problems and pathos that come with money. And how do you do that? So it's always that problem of scale. And it might be where we have to have a more sophisticated discussion on the right size, so that we're close enough to nature, to where you're getting the benefits of that. You're not feeling alienated and disconnected, but also where you're not being idealistic about the possibilities of scaling something and having it apply to millions of people without a breakup. It becomes something that's maybe more federalist, dare I say, tribal.
Sure.
I know Bard is big on the tribal thing. But not even realizing you need a dialectic between those two is going to get you into trouble. And I think very often that is where people fall. They don't even think about the need of that dialectic. And then you end up with the pathological world.
This is where these discussions, as you're invoking the intellectual deep web, which is this whole crew of these people who are name dropping around, we have to create dialectics between these styles in order to find middle ground, find emergent territory of truly creating, as Charles Eisenstein calls, and this comes up pretty much every interview, the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. This does not mean utopia. This does not mean socialism. It just means a more beautiful world that's elegantly designed. And I think Buckminster Fuller had a lot to say about that. And his systems theories and the critical path, he was describing all this stuff in the 1950s and post-World War II US. And he saw it very clearly. And he's very hard-nosed with his science. Now, I want to define some terms here because I think it's really valuable. Game A versus game B, right? The most simple way to put it that I like, I'd love to hear your definition too, is in game theory. Game A is zero sum. So game A, there's a dominance hierarchy, there's a capitalistic, predatory nature where if I win, you'll probably lose. And this can be with money, this can be with equity, this can be with women, this can be with resources. In game B, which the Stoa, our friends at the Stoa, and I think another collaboration, put out this interesting video that was game B that, I had heard game B a lot in the communities I was in around authentic relating, radical honesty, and some of Ken Wilber's work, integral theory, and, this whole, pseudo hippie, but also highly intellectual circles and retreats I was a part of. And game B is basically positive sum. So actually we can either increase the size of the pie, so there's more to go around. We can distribute and actualize resources differently, where actually if I win, you can win as well. And actually we want to play games that are positive sum and synergistic. So actually I only win when you win. Right. So the kind of simple version of this is capitalistic socialism or social democracy, but I think it actually goes much deeper, that there's some kind of emergence of the balkanization of tribal ideology, which the internet's already done. There's all these niches and tribes and groups. We represent one such overlap. And that you have to organize with smaller groups inside of Dunbar's number, 150 to 200 humans, something like this. And then mitigate resources and alliances with all those groups to create some kind of game B. Synarchy is a word I like, where it's a synergistic hierarchy, because hierarchy still exists, but we do it in a more symbiotic way with each other in nature.
No, marvelous. I mean, I think very generally that is a lot of talk on the difference between game A and game B. That game A is zero sum, game B is non-zero sum, and you're trying to solve, dare I say, if everyone is rational within a game A situation, then you get a suboptimal result, a Nash equilibrium, and so you overcome that by changing the metrics and making the goal become cooperative, so you're going to get a better result in different things. That's generally how it speaks. A few things. It becomes difficult because generally speaking, so there's this really important book I think is important. You never hear the guy's name. His name's Lepretko, and he talks about the breakdown of nations. And it's basically what I was saying. He basically wants to say that any system, capitalism, Marxism, socialism, the perfect system, just whatever the perfect system is, it doesn't matter. Whatever, all systems at a certain scale collapse. They don't work anymore. And you see, part of the issue, for example, there's a difference between, say, a capitalism of free market enterprises where there is no corporate structure as we know. Let's say it's all LLCs, for example, but not LLCs that can, say, expand on a global nationalistic system that is going to solve what von Mises calls the calculation problem and what Hayek calls the knowledge problem. And what the knowledge problem is basically the problem that the 99.9% of the information that makes up a society is information you cannot know unless you are in it. So, for example, how many plastic straws does the local diner need to order next week? I don't care if you're freaking Albert Einstein. There's no way to know that unless you work in the restaurant. And the issue is like 99.9% of information is that. And you can't, it doesn't matter how smart you are. It has basically nothing to do with intelligence. It's particular knowledge that can only be known in the particularity of being there. Well, shoot. In order to have an efficient society, you somehow have to coordinate a whole lot of information that you can't know unless you're there. And thus, you generate the pricing system. Thus, you generate free markets. The issue is, following someone like Dietrich Mikowski or a lot of the capitalist economies, Game A precisely came into existence because it was originally non-zero sum. Everyone benefited from it. We could figure out it was non-zero sum. And also, it's especially clear once we understand that the number one thing that improves our lives is not, going back to tech. It's mostly technology. It's air conditioning. It's the electricity. Money is not what makes your life better. It's actually technology, and money. The whole reason that capitalism was successful following a Dietrich Mikowski is because the system was created that stimulated innovation and creativity. Now, that's an entirely different conversation. She is not saying that just capitalism can do it. She goes through the whole history and different things like that. But the point is that Game A was really good at creating technologies of which everyone benefits from. Because once the computer is invented, you can have a computer. I can have a computer. I can have air conditioning. You can have air conditioning. Maybe the guy who invented the air conditioning gets the $1 million or whatever that we do not get. But we do, in fact, have an increase in our quality of life because of the technology. But here's the problem. Game A then fell into issues of scale, where you then get corporations and too big to fail entities, and it ceases to be interested in technological innovation and instead becomes more about, say, shareholder benefit that could be independent of the creation of innovation. So then Game A, and it would be a very long conversation, but generally Game A became more zero sum than non-zero sum, right? But here's the big question I think we have to ask. Does that mean Game A needs to be replaced with Game B, a different system, or does Game A need to be reformed? So, for example, I think colleges have a monopoly on credentials. Monopolies lead to inefficiencies. You break up on the monopoly of credentials, that could unleash different things. Corporations, the market is, everyone says the market is rational, right? And that's why it's so good. It works because the market is rational. One that conflates rational and right, and that's a mistake. But but that aside, what's really rational? What's super rational? Becoming invincible. Because if you're invincible, nobody has to defeat you. And so if you can become an invincible corporation that no one can defeat, or they can't take you down without destroying the entire system, like too big to fail or whatever, that's super rational. But here's the problem. Why does free markets work? They work generally because self-regulation and self-interest are combined. If I own a store and I piss you off, you're not going to buy from me anymore. So I have to self-regulate in order to make money off of you, right? But if I'm invincible, I don't have to self-regulate at all. I can do whatever I want. And so once you have entities that are of a certain scale, the ethic of capitalism, if you will, which is the combination of self-interest and self-regulation, breaks. And now you have a problem. And of course, you have a problem if GDP correlates with fossil fuels that are destroying the environment. I mean, you could basically take a chart on a country's GDP. Vikos, I can never say his name. He's like the energy economist guy. He shows this. You can correlate a country's GDP with its energy use really closely. It's like really closely. That might be a problem if you have a non-renewable energies or something, if you have something like that. So, but then the debate becomes, do we get to non-zero sum cement? It's almost like Protestants, Catholics, like a religious debate almost. Do you get, should we be trying to reform Game A by making it so corporations cannot become too big to fail? Or should we be trying to replace Game A? That's kind of, that might seem like a silly technical. I mean, that's to me a big question.
Is how do we create systems that work for everyone? Because the essential thesis of Buckminster Fuller, and many people have pointed this out, since around the time of World War II, where industrialism and capitalism kind of were peaking, we've had, and this can be proved quantitatively. This is not a utopian, like hippy dippy vision. We've had enough resources, technology, and distribution to feed, clothe, and house every single human. To a decent degree. Not everyone can live in Malibu in a 16-bedroom mansion, but everybody could have very simple access to clean water and enough food to eat. The fact that so many children are dying from curable diseases and are starving in the third world is an egregious symptom of a sickness at the heart of capitalism. And that's why these kind of, it's not just capitalism, it's the folks running it. And
yeah.
Is there an elite class of psychopaths behind this? I don't know. Are there corporations that through this Kafkaesque bureaucracy have become decoupled with the needs of human beings and the environment? 100%. And so it goes back to the incentive structures. It goes back to psychology. Okay, what's behind that? Well, it goes to consciousness. And this is why a lot of the teachers or the philosophers that I most love the only thing that's going to steer us, not that we need to go into a game B utopian tribal, regression into the past. I also don't think game A can continue for another 100 years the way it's going.
Sure.
So consciousness itself, and this is where I'll invoke Joseph Campbell and myth and storytelling, which is a guiding vessel for consciousness, because a culture is only as healthy as its mythology. And the mythology right now, if you watch the Super Bowl halftime show or you watch a Bud Light commercial, the mythology and the images, the memes, the imagos that the culture is pumping at us, it's absurdist, it's it's irrational, and it has this kind of, Rome is burning and we're having a barbecue. Fuck it. Let's crack another beer. There's something kind of wild about it that I think people unconsciously can sense. Folks like us who are studying and reading and leaning into this stuff, we're definitely tracking it. I just wonder about, this decade, which seems to be a quite critical decade, much as the 1920s were. Economically, the 1920s were one of the most critical decades in the last century. I think we're seeing our own version of that right now.
Oh, sure.
Instead of the roaring 20s, I think the 2020s are the soaring 20s. And
Oh yeah.
Where do we go from here? I'd love if you, because I've been following this thread. This is a huge email thread with a bunch of crazy philosophers like Daniel and I. And this is something that we're talking about. And you mentioned the Dark Renaissance. Do you want to quickly define that or bring that into the conversation?
Oh, our dear friend, Mr. Bard and wonderful Raven and Owen and Cadell, these lovely people they had. And I really am impressed by the story to kind of house both sides of the discussion. It's so easy to, just be Fox News and have your conservative people or MSNBC with liberals. So I really like what the Stoa has done with Peter and different Mr. Limburg and different things. The Dark Renaissance basically is going to be critiquing what can be some of the utopian appeals of Game B, the back to nature, the idea that you can have a non-competitive. There is in some of the thinkers like over at Techno Social with Mr. Frege and Owen, with Brendan over there, there could be this idea of, do you think that human nature can change? Do you think that it's possible for humans to develop, or is there some sort of what Mr. Bard, I believe, calls pathos? Is there some sort of human pathos that you can never overcome, that you can at best manage, but you cannot solve it? Because if you have to manage it, then any system that does not take that seriously, or instead says, okay, we're going to create a system of non-competition where everybody works together, and it will work because we're going to train people to develop out of the human pathos, the Dark Renaissance would be going, that doesn't work, because you cannot, Gerard, mimetic desire, all these different things. And what Game A successfully did, which now it is arguably, as Mr. Ebert would say, cancerous, because it does not integrate with an ethic of being willing to die. It's too big to fail. It goes on forever. And so indeed is cancerous in the ways you described. And we can talk more about that. But Game A did manage to convince people to use their pathological natures to go and be productive members of society, and to not, say, use violence to take over the neighboring tribes, like you see in the Icelandic literature, like the Edda or the Volsung Saga or different things like that. But, at the same time, there does seem to be truth to the fact that people can develop or get better ideas and so on and so forth. Of course, the problem is scale. Like, it's the majority. Will the majority? It's almost like this. Do you think the majority is going to use the internet to, say, become better philosophers, to meet different people, to expand diversity, to be more open to difference? Or are most people going to use the internet to run from the difficulties of life, say with YouTube videos or just endless entertainment, right? That might be axiomatic. That might be kind of negative to say, well, the majority will always use for the bad. Heck, that might even be elitist to say that, right? There's all these fair critiques to have. And yet, if it is the case that the majority of people are always going to have some sort of pathos that is going to actually come out in the more perfect side. This is kind of the funny thing. If we follow Dante, I think maybe it was Ken Forrester. He wrote a book called The Two Dantes. I can't remember. He points out that the Inferno is actually a manifestation of God's grace trying to reach people who hate that grace. So in a sense, hell is God to people that hate God, right? So it's actually the goodness of that causes the intensity of hell, right? And so there's also this idea that the sandcastle you want to destroy is the one that's really intricate and beautiful. Like, the more beautiful and intricate it is, the more you just want to kick it. There's like the spider web. You want to destroy it. There's something in human beings that like to do that. And so it could be precisely because Game B is so freaking great that can bring out the worst in people. Not necessarily. Maybe the greatness of game B trains people out of that nature, nurture environment, right? All these different things. And it may depend on the particular individuals who are in the society. For example, if game B sounds great to you, you might be of the personality type and the intellectual kind of way of thinking, openness, that if you joined a game B, it would work great. You might be able to get together with 70 people and it's like the greatest thing you ever did. And you're so glad you did it. You know, the issue is, does game B work for people who think it's stupid? Because capitalism seems to work for people. And also, I should make a distinction. There is a difference to be made between like corporatism, capitalism, price mechanisms. You know, when I was defending the price, when I was talking about the price mechanism as a system of distributed resources, that does not necessarily mean 2022 capitalism should thus be kept. You know, you have to maintain all those distinctions, right? But you see, generally speaking, you can think capitalism is the worst thing on planet Earth and still get a laptop thanks to someone inventing it in capitalism, right? You don't have to like capitalism for there still to be things you can go to the store. That doesn't mean capitalism is good, but it works. But arguably, that's part of the problem. It doesn't need you to like it to work, so that's why it can oppress you. It doesn't need your assent, right? But it also doesn't need your assent. There's a tragedy here. You know, for a system to be a system and not simply an ideology, if you will, which is something that works only if people believe in it, then it has to be able to work without you. But that's precisely why it can ruin you. You know, it doesn't need you. And so isn't that's the kind of strange dynamic of power you have to operate in. And so I would generally say,
well, do you think capitalism is an ideology though? Because I feel like to some,
so they always overlap. Yes, you have like Marcuse and the Frankfurt School and things like that. So you have system and ideology, and I'm not going to swear I will maintain this distinction in anywhere other than this conversation, because I'm sure I have a paper written 5 years ago where I define these terms completely opposite that I forgot about. But a system is something that works. Let's say you program it and then it works. Okay. So system and program. Whereas an ideology is something that works with constant negotiation, like people describing it. I guess I would put it this way. If you have a pile of dirt, okay, and a shovel, a ideology is where I have to convince you to go over, take the shovel and put the dirt in the hole. So that means I have to deal with your personality. That means I have to deal with you as a person. I have to convince you it's worth doing. Okay. So there's negotiation with ideology. And by ideology here, I mean something that requires ideas to happen. You know, in order for it to come into existence and function, there has to be ideas. So I have to put the idea in your head that you should do this. Okay. I have to negotiate with you. In a system per se, there's a robot. Well, I just program the robot. I don't have to deal with any pathos. I don't have to deal with anything. It just goes over, digs the hole, and, it gets the dirt and puts it in the hole. I don't have to deal with pathos at all. So that would be a system. A system is more robotic. An ideology is more human. Every system that humans make is a mixture of both. And systems incubate ideologies, and ideologies create systems. You only make the system because you have ideas. So they go back and forth. The issue is that in order for something the more it scales, the more the system scales, the more it has to become a system than an ideology. Because it's not going to be possible to negotiate with 10 million people. It's not going to be possible to talk with 10 million people and convince them that game B is a good idea. You're not going to be able to do it. And even if you did, they may just not listen to you, or they may not care, or different things like that. So the more you scale, the more it has to rely on programming and systematizing. When it's down to earth, it can rely more on ideology per se. And in ideology, I'm not using it like in a Marxist, it's always bad. I'm just saying like a complex of ideas, a schema of ideas. Then there's going to have to be more negotiation. Hey, arguably, it's more human down here. Arguably, it might be better down here because there's actual relationships. We actually have to deal with people. We can't run from them. So maybe this is, like I said, game B communities sound great. Hey, let's go live in one, and different things. And, Michelle, like I mentioned, Michelle and I ran an art gallery venue before Unoya. We went all around and did these different things. The problem is the more you scale, the bigger it becomes, the more it's going to have to become a system and do programming. But here's the problem. The more it scales, the more it relies on a system, there's no human element anymore. You can't negotiate the system out of what it's doing. You can't say, hey, you're not feeding all the children. Hey, there's a lot of sick people like you were mentioning earlier. System's going to keep going. And this is why the very efficiency of capitalism could be a horrible problem. Everyone's like, well, the market's rational and efficient. Yeah, the problem is the market's not always right. Yeah, it's rational relative to what you program per se. It is rational to the premises of what it accepts on what is the good life, what is human, and it's going to get really, really, really efficient at that. Well, if it's getting efficient at something that kills the human per se, or that reduces us to simply bodies and not people, if it kills the spirit, if you will, You might have a Super Bowl halftime. So like you described, you may have a mental illness.
The great paradox. It's like we're living in radical abundance, especially if you can listen or watch this, anyone who's listening or watching now or later, on a phone or a computer or your headphones, you're living in some of the most privileged times in technology of all time, like better than any emperor could have dreamed hundreds of years ago. And yet the meaning crisis, the level of mental illness, the suicide rates, all of these challenges that we're seeing on the level of spirit or psyche or mind, God, it's the transcendent dimension that seems to be suffering inside the material efficiency. And so to me, it's like, I have lived in Game B type communities. I've lived on permaculture off-grid farms. I've been to these events, Burning Man, festival culture, the various ashrams, the elements that I think some of the Game B folks were invoking, and they do have an amazing beauty within them. And yet I still needed Wi-Fi to book my plane ticket. I still needed clean water, which was actually mediated by some kind of technology and alliance with another group that may not have been in Game B. And so I would like to see, and there's this idea that, in hunter-gatherer culture, which is often set up against the agrarian culture, that when a tribe got too big, and again, this is that Dunbar's number, 150-ish, that it would break off. So usually there's a hierarchy element where the alphas, whether they're male or female, had some kind of there was a deadlock and some kind of thing that needed to happen. And resource-wise, they're like, hey, listen, we were only killing this many animals, foraging this much. We need to actually go to different territories. And so there would be sometimes probably a warlike, but also often probably a peaceful, let's break off and we'll actually form a new tribe. And could you imagine if the companies, the banks, the military powers, when they became too big to govern and started to becoming inhuman, that there was some kind of agreement where the two CEOs or whatever were like, all right, I'm actually going to go found a different company that's similar, and we're going to go to this market, and they're going to shake hands on it and actually create some kind of mutually beneficial economic, military, diplomatic agreement in that space. That to me is like a very simplistic, but one way that a Game B type of energy could emerge inside of the rampant Game A that we're living in.
Oh yeah, and Cadell Lass, his fantastic sub-arc where he talks about Game A/B kind of thing, where you're escaping these kind of either-or thinking. The either-or thinking can be very problematic. And again, Mr. Rutt had a discussion on Parallax where he was talking about the fact that, there's a single solar flare, EMP, electromagnetic pulse, that could wipe out civilization, destroy massive cities, and that Game A is not prepared for that. It's not anti-fragile. I'm quite sympathetic to that point because there's this irony of the more complex a society becomes, the more fragile it becomes. Complexity and fragility go together. It's not that complexity becomes the more complex it's more together, it actually can become more fragile. And that's a very fair point. And then you can think of Game B as thinking of ways to make Game A anti-fragile, but is that replacement or reform? Then it might just be a Council of Nicaea where we get together and get into the nitty gritties of particular terms and everyone wants to kill each other because they don't agree on what a hypostatic union or something like this. So we don't want that. But at the same time, I think there is personally, I think when Dark Renaissance is skeptical of the ability for the majority, and that sounds elitist, but it's not really elitist because we're not saying who is the majority. You might be a professor at Princeton, be part of the majority because you're closed-minded in your great intellectualism. This is not the lower and upper. When we talk about the majority, that does not mean the blue collar people. That's actually classism that capitalism has incubated in people's thoughts. I'm convinced that some of the most closed-minded people are in fact the professors at these universities, the supposedly diverse people. So, but anyway, where the Dark Renaissance is kind of the majority may not develop out of the pathos in the way that you are thinking. And then you're going to, if that's the case, then the system of Game A that's able to, dare I say, trick pathos to be constructive or to work together may be the best. You have to take this seriously. It's a very hard problem. And also to what you're saying, you look, what is it, Quinn's Ismail, where he talks about hunter-gatherer, and obviously everyone talks about guns, germs, and steels, and Homo sapien, all those different things. Well, what's interesting is that any of us right now, there are indeed quote-unquote Game B tribes, just like you said. There are, in fact, different ones. Any of us could right now go live in one. We could leave technological society and go live with one. Very few of us do. Many of us will visit. Many of us will stay there, but most of us don't stay because we really like Wi-Fi. We really like electricity. What we like to do, and this would actually be a reflection of human pathos, is talk about how great that is on our computer. While we keep the computer. I completely, utterly respect. I have utmost respect for someone really kind of like the Amish. They literally don't use tech. They're like, Game A sucks. We don't like it. We're going to do our own thing. And they literally pay the price. I'm not saying everyone should be Amish or that I agree with their theology, but you see, that's paying a price, right? That's really respectable. And that also is not, though, to say that critiques of Game A are not utterly necessary. It's to say this, I guess what I'm saying is we actually all do want basically an A-B kind of thing that Cadell Last is talking about. That is what's unveiled by how we live our life. We're looking for some sort of dialectical relationship between the two, not a running to a game B or an A, even if we talk in a manner that makes it seem like we want to completely escape game A. Because the reason I say that it has to be a dialectic is because the moment you say Wi-Fi, the moment you say, I like Wi-Fi, someone has to build the towers, someone has to maintain the towers, someone has to construct the roads to have the truck to go to the place to build the tower, someone has to convince people to drive those trucks, someone has to find enough honor and status in the act of driving that truck that they're going to do it. Then suddenly you have a supply chain. Suddenly you have a supply chain. Millions of people are needed to make that happen. And then you don't even get into the raw earth material that goes into making the Wi-Fi tower possible. Oh my goodness. Now you need ships. Now you need planes. Now you need airport. It's that famous nobody knows how to make a pencil economic argument that is made. It's crazy. But the moment you need a supply chain to make the internet possible, you need a system of, here it comes, incentives and motives and values to make people make that supply chain. Oh, crap. What is that? Oh, now we're back into capitalist competition. Oh, no. Crap. You see? Even to keep the internet that we love, you end up relying on the game A system, right? And of course, listen to Mr. Rutt and all these, Mr. Rutt, they're not saying that, Mr. Rutt made a point in the parallax discussion to say that game A got millions of people out of poverty and different things like that. He made a point. Sure. That's Dietrich McCloskey. That's economic history. And it certainly did. The problem is what you're saying. The way I think the great, there's kind of a fatal flaw in capitalism, and it's what I was alluding to earlier. And it's precisely the problem that I mentioned. It is rational to become invincible. But once you become, the market works, very general, everything I'm saying, it works because it uses rationality in self-interest. But the thing that is most rational to do is to become invincible so you can never lose the game. But once you do that, self-regulation and self-interest are separated. The system must therefore make sure that it is not possible to become too big to fail. That is extremely reliant on the government. And the central banks. You get your Greenspan puts, you get your Bernanke puts, you get your bailouts, you get governments who are receiving, the corporation. But here's the problem. The corporations have great interest to convince the government to get involved with the market because then it can be in their interest. So there is an incentive to corrupt the state to then turn a free market into a mixed market. And now someone like Cornel West will say, and there was never actually a true free market. That's fine. That's all perfectly fine. And, it's always been more mixed market, and that would be a technical debate and so on and so forth. But let's put it this way. Granting all that Dr. West and different people would say, if it is indeed the case that it is inevitable for free markets to eventually turn into mixed markets, then it is in fact practically inevitable, even if it is not theoretically inevitable. That's an important distinction, by the way. There is nothing in the theory of capitalism that says it must turn into a mixed market, theoretically, but it could still be the case that it is practically inevitable that a free market turns into a mixed market, precisely because of how human beings are. Well, if that's the case, then game A has a kind of self-consuming mechanism in it. It's only a matter of time once it gets to a certain scale. And it's only a matter of time that it gets to that scale. And so then you need game B reform discussions and different. Actually, I think you can go to the history of religions and see all the debates between Shiite Sufis and the Protestants, Catholic. That's actually kind of where there's a debate on reform, schism, denominations, what is going on. It's actually kind of a useful framework to think about what's going on. In my view, that would be another discussion. But that seems to be why a game B discussion is warranted. But we all seem to want in our practice an A-B thing, just by the fact that we don't go live in game B tribes.
This is the binary nature of seeking the polarity that we're seeing play out. And,
Yes.
I forget who said it, but correctly identifying a problem is halfway on the way to solving it.
Oh, yeah.
So if the more we get closer to enunciating and describing what a game B architecture could look like, and obviously this is a lot of what we're talking about is financial and economic, but for me, it's more around the cultural synthesis of culture itself, which is our morals, our values, our actual society and how we interact, and along with, integrating with nature, integrating with each other, and the good, the true, the beautiful, the more transcendent values, and actually lifting consciousness and storytelling. We need new mythology, we need new myth. And I'm biased because I'm a bard and that's what I see and I do. But that to me actually could be one of those lead dominoes that informs the entire system. So we're going to pause that conversation because I know we could go on forever.
Well, I do want to just add that there is sense, and then I'll close on it. What you're getting at is very important, because since there is no pure system or pure ideology, there's nothing is purely one. The role of ideas is always going to be very, very important. There is no system. There is no system that works all the time without the right ideas. And if theoretically every CEO and every corporation or whatever had ideas that cared about people, or they weren't just focused on stockholders, then game A could be the same quote unquote system and yet become non-zero sum, right? So this gets into the role of, like you said, culture and ideas. And that's why I think NFTs and trying to bring a signal of what the good ideas are and what we want to be actually can have a very big role in finding that A-B balance, because all dialectics, like an A/B thing, is ultimately held together by ideas, because no system can be dialectical. Dialectics are a result of humans. And so it becomes up to what the humans do in that system to make it dialectical between their souls, themselves, and the machine per se. So what you're getting at, the role of culture is critical for a successful dialectic.
100%. So Daniel,
this is delightful. My goodness, I enjoyed this.
I know we have to put together another massive long stream with the crew. It's something I'm inspired about. But why don't you share where people can find you, anything you have coming up, exciting things you can offer if people want to learn more about your work?
Well, you might just find me in Kevin's kitchen, because I might have to fly down there to keep talking about this. So, that might be where you find, because this is all really, now I got these notes, I'm going to write something. So anyway, ogrose.com. You can find me on a small farm in Central Virginia. Just send a carrier pigeon. If it has a little red flag, I'll recognize it. Shoot a flare, I'll know. And ogrose.com, Twitter, YouTube, Anchor, YouTube. Michelle, my wife, she does on the Instagram. I do the Twitter. She does the Anchor. So we're all over the different things. But hopefully you can find me here again, because I've really enjoyed speaking with Kevin about this very important topic.
Daniel, so grateful for you. Be sure to check him out. He'll be tagged up here. If you're watching live, thank you for being here. Please comment, share your perspective, maybe tag someone who would really benefit from this conversation. And if you're listening over on the podcasting world, it's all in the show notes. So until next time, family,
excellent.
Following the good, the true, and the beautiful. See you next time.
Have a great one.